Hello, my name is Leah Albright Bird, and I am a consultant and activist in the fight against human trafficking. Welcome to our discussion about law enforcement as it relates to the commercial sexual exploitation of children, also known as CSEC. I'm really excited to be here with three criminal justice professionals who are regularly intervening and supporting these amazing kids. So to get started, how about each of you introduce yourselves and share a little bit about what you do here in Los Angeles County?
Hi, I'm Sergeant Jeff Walker with the LA County Sheriff's Department. I'm assigned to the LA Regional Human Trafficking Task Force, and I'm a founding member of that task force since 2015.
Hi, I'm Amanda Detterline, Supervisory Special Agent for the FBI's Crimes Against Children and Human Trafficking Task Force here in Los Angeles.
Hello, I am Guillermo Santiso. I am a Deputy District Attorney with the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. I've been prosecuting human sex trafficking cases for approximately 4 years now.
Thank you so much for your introductions. I feel like I need to highlight that law enforcement is such an inextricable, valuable part of this issue that we're discussing today. And so let's go ahead and jump right in. The first question that I have is, how can law enforcement support this issue?
The best way we can support our victims is, the primary way is our advocates and our partners within the task force. That's the primary way we can do that. But the way our law enforcement officers and our detectives can support the victim is really just providing good communication, providing constant updates about what's going on with the case, trying to avoid curveballs, because these girls don't really take surprises very well, especially in a court of law or in an investigation, and safety. We have to make sure that their safety is dealt with, and there's so many ways these victims can be threatened through social media, through the internet, through cell phones, things like that, that there has to be a constant communication between them and our detective to make sure that we can provide for their safety. And then obviously once we get into the court process, then that's where Guillermo comes in to prepare the victims for court.
Communication is crucial. When I first meet a victim for a preliminary hearing or for a trial, it's very important to let them know what to expect. Most of the time, these victims do not want to have to testify, so it's important for me to communicate to them what to expect, why their testimony is so important, why they are important to the process, and also I'm big on ensuring that they can get from me that I actually do care. I care about them. I care about them. I try to let them know that I understand why they may not want to testify, why it may be difficult for them, and I feel like if I can communicate that to them, they will be more willing to testify more openly in court. And also, a big thing is to use the right language, the types of words that you use. Oftentimes, I've heard it called a trauma-informed language, and that's key because you don't want to re-victimize them when they're testifying.
Yeah, like both Jeff and Guillermo said, we take a very victim-centered approach when it comes to our investigations. Oftentimes, we are the immediate assistance to the victims because we're encountering them first. So providing that immediate assistance from the get-go and then continuing that with our partners in a multidisciplinary team. We can't do this job without a task force approach with our local partners, our prosecutors, us as law enforcement officers. The whole team approach is how we can support these investigations.
That's great. And so as I move on to the next question, it's obvious that you all are already very sensitive to the needs of the population, but what are some examples of ways that kids are re-traumatized in this process, and how can advocates impact change?
Well, anytime a criminal investigation occurs, there's going to be interviews. There's going to be times when we have to have the victims recount very traumatizing events. And they may have to do it more than once. There's multiple interviews they're going to have to go through with DCFS, with the Children's Services, with law enforcement, perhaps with the district attorney's office. There's many ways they can be re-traumatized, and we try to do our best to minimize it, but I can't guarantee, and we can never guarantee, there's going to be absolutely no re-traumatization. It's just how it is. We have to get to the facts of the case, and in the process of doing that, we need to get to we need to get them to recall the events. That's how we establish the crime.
Thank you. Did you all have anything you want to add to that?
It is very victim-centered, and so we rely very heavily on the victim's statements to then corroborate the evidence that we're looking for in our investigation. So occasionally it can re-traumatize victims, and then as we get into the court process and the trial process, that recounting those investigations or those experiences can also potentially re-traumatize them.
I believe communication is big. When you meet with the victim, one of the first things I do is I let them know who I am, and I ask them, where are you at? Are we going to talk about today what you told the police, or are you somewhere else today? And I just let them know, look, you're going to do what you're going to do up there, and I'm going to still do my job. I'm going to still do everything I can to hold this trafficker accountable, but regardless of whether they're being quote-unquote difficult, if they are scared to testify and therefore not going to be forthcoming about what happened with the trafficker, I'm still the same person. I don't get upset, I don't get frustrated. I'll do my job regardless of whether they're going to be on board or not on board. And I think just that communication with them is key.
Thank you so much for your sensitivity with that. I really appreciate that. Okay, so when you're working with this population, how do you not see them as another case, and how do you take the time to establish trust with them?
Well, we're somewhat, it's kind of good and bad. It's bad that no girl should ever have to go through this, but the good news is that they're not running down the street yelling down, I'm a victim, I'm a victim. So we don't have tons and tons of girls knocking on our doors, so our detectives are not overloaded. And in fact, we target a lower caseload for these detectives, our detectives on the task force, because we want to spend time with them. Okay, so this case is less. These cases are victim-centered, not victim-built. So we don't want these detectives to have 30 cases like they do at the station level, where these detectives are doing 30, 40 cases at a time. They have 2 to 5 cases because these cases are high on victim management. So I don't want them to have all these cases over here to have to deal with that. I want them to have low caseload so they can manage these victims. They can talk to these victims on their days off, on their weekends, in the middle of the night if they have to, when these victims are in crisis. And I tell all my detectives they have to have their phones on. You have to be able to reach out to these victims any time of the day or night. That's why you're not getting 30 cases, because you're expected to be able to work with these victims. And then beyond that, I'm constantly harping, I might go into another question later, but I'm constantly harping on them about being judgy. You can't be judgy. You have to understand that the prostitution that you're witnessing is a symptom. It's like a fever. It has nothing to do with who they are. Get past that and go right to the kid, go right to the victim. And once you get right to the victim, that's where you get your statements, that's where you get your criminal case. And then beyond that, once you deal with that, you have to pretend like the victim's no longer there anymore in terms of the criminal case. And then you have to go get the evidence elsewhere. You have to go get your cell phone evidence. You have to go get your surveillance video. You have to get all that stuff, because if she's not available, if she doesn't want to testify, I got to be able to give something to Guillermo beyond if I can't produce that victim. So these cases are victim-centered, not victim-built. We make sure that the victims get all the right resources that they need, but we still try to do a criminal case beyond that, irregardless of whether the victim's there.
That's incredible.
Leah, I think we've come a very long way. We've gotten a lot of training as law enforcement officers now on how to deal with trafficking victims. So we recognize now the grooming and the seasoning that these traffickers do with the victims that they encounter or that they're victimizing. And because of that, that trauma bond that we've talked about and other people have talked about, it takes a time for us to break. And so, like Jeff said, taking that victim-centered approach and really taking our time on these investigations and working with these victims, Oftentimes we're meeting as law enforcement officers with them, not to find something out about our investigation or our evidence, but just to build rapport with them and get them to understand, like them, we are people, they are people, and we're here to try to find the evidence that we need to prosecute the trafficker. So it is rapport building too sometimes, just with them.
The trust for me begins, as Sergeant Walker was saying, at the initial onset of the investigation, when the victim has a good initial contact with law enforcement, and that begins a relationship with which, if a case gets filed, can last anywhere from 3 months all the way to a couple of years, depending on how long it takes the case to get through the system. But if the victim has a good experience from the beginning, then finally when they come and meet me to testify at a hearing or at a trial, I hope that by then the investigating officer has established a good relationship, has established trust with the victim, but they have also started speaking to the victim about me and what to expect from me. Hey, I've worked with Guillermo before. You know, he's gonna be good to you. He's gonna treat you good. Be open with him. So the trust starts from the beginning and just continues through the relationship. But I'm also big, once they come to me, I try to always ask them some fact about them that if I see them again, I could ask them about it again. So then it could just be some random fact. For instance, I had a case where the girl was, she was trafficked, she was brought to court by her father, and they went to Chick-fil-A for lunch, right? But then I saw her 6 months later. I'm like, hey, I remember you. I remember you came to court with your dad and you guys had Chick-fil-A. So just some fact to show that you're not just another person in one of my cases. I remember you because, you had that Chick-fil-A with your dad, or because you told me about your birthday, or because you told me you were gonna go to prom. So try to remember some specific fact about them that I can bring up in the future to show them I remember who they are, and that I care enough to remember that fact.
It's powerful, powerful. So moving along, what role can advocates play in supporting the investigation process?
Critical is everybody has a prejudice about police, okay? Everybody has a preconceived notions, sometimes good, more times bad. But our detectives that are investigating sex trafficking cases are an entirely different breed of detectives. This is all they do. They're not doing anything else. They're not investigating auto theft. They're not doing anything else but sex trafficking cases, working with CSECs. So we specifically groom and recruit them for their ability to do that. So with that being said, the advocates can feel comfortable saying, these guys are the good guys. I can't vouch for every police officer in the country or in the LA Sheriff's Department, but the ones that we have are good people. And the advocates can feel confident in saying, you can trust these guys, you can trust these girls, they're gonna work your case, they're gonna put somebody in jail, they're gonna seek justice for you.
I'd say advocates can continue being advocates, right? We work in a partnership together. We investigate the case, we're looking for our evidence to build to prosecute that trafficker. But we need our advocates because when we're going through that, like we talked about already, traumatization can reoccur. And we need our advocates to be there for the victims then to kind of hand them off to our advocates at that point to work in a relationship together so that we're not continually re-traumatizing them during our investigative process. So working together but in our own lanes, I think, is how we can support each other. And if investigative facts come through to an advocate, I would hope that that advocate would be telling me as a law enforcement officer, hey, victim said X, and you should follow up on that next time you talk to her or him.
Okay. Guillermo, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I believe obviously to support the victim and whatever support that victim needs on that particular day, but also to encourage communication with law enforcement and also with the prosecutor.
Sure, sure.
One of the, just wanted to add that for many police officers, the end of the criminal case is the end of it. For the DA, it's the end of it for the law enforcement officer. But for these victims, the trauma is multi-layered, and it doesn't end at the criminal case. In fact, the trauma may not end for years after that. So I can't high five and chest pump my guys and say, hey, we did a good job, and say, see you later, kid, do your thing. It doesn't work like that way. That's why we need our advocates. That's why in human trafficking we have to have that partnership. It's not like auto theft task forces where I can just slap a subpoena in the victim's hand that owned a car and say, be in court. He doesn't need all this care and after the criminal case, but these victims are going to need that. And as law enforcement officers and as DAs, we're not social workers, we're not therapists, we're not prepared. We can't do that, but we know the people that we can hand them off to, like Amanda said.
Absolutely. So we've sort of, with that answer, touched on the importance of collaboration, but is there anything else that you can add to speak to the importance of cross-system collaboration?
Our task force was the first to actually co-locate everybody in the same office. And at first I was like, I guess it's important. But as time went on, it's very important. It's because it's different to talk to somebody on the phone that's a voice on another line. Yeah, I'll get that to you, or yeah, I'll do that for you, whatever. But when you're in the same office looking at them every day and they want something from you, it's hard to say, I'll get that to you whenever. You're looking at them every day. So it encourages that communication, encourages everybody to do their job, because you're going to face them every single day in the office.
Yeah, it's extremely important for us to work in that task force environment. If we didn't, I don't think that we could successfully investigate these cases. We know traffickers move victims throughout local cities, local counties, through different states across the nation and internationally. So without law enforcement partners, without victim advocates around the country and working all together, it would not be easy for us to come up with the evidence that we need to prosecute these guys. So we know traffickers are moving victims everywhere, and without that approach of a multidisciplinary team that's multi-jurisdictional, we wouldn't be as successful as we are.
Mm-hmm. Right, so the traffickers have networks, but our networks are stronger.
Right.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
We need a team approach on these cases.
Okay.
Everybody needs to work together for the final result of holding that trafficker accountable and doing it in a way possible that least traumatizes the victim.
Okay. What I'd like for you to do is to describe some behaviors from kids in foster care and trafficking that signal exploitation. So tattoo markings or anything physical or behavioral that you're witnessing.
Tattoos, the ones that immediately jump out are money signs, diamonds and crowns. Those are the first ones, as well as the brand of the trafficker on anywhere on a visible portion of the body. And then beyond that, unexplained money, unexplained clothes, AWOL behavior, running away, coming back, especially running away on a Friday and coming back on a Sunday with a bunch of money. Talking about a boyfriend, but not giving much information about that boyfriend, things of that nature.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. We see that children in foster care will often run away. They'll come back and they'll have new clothing, they'll have new hairdos, they'll have their nails done if they're females potentially. Sometimes they come back with different types of tattoos like Jeff mentioned. They'll be branded sometimes, and as he said, they'll be talking about their boyfriend or potentially their daddy, and they won't have anything else to say about that particular subject.
So when we're addressing this issue, we tend to focus a lot on the female victims, and I believe that's obviously very important, but what about the male victims?
Well, I think we can say that sometimes males just don't identify as victims, and so it's sometimes harder for us to locate them and find them to go forward with an investigation. I think you could say the same thing about socioeconomic status, right? A lot of our victims come from a low socioeconomic status, but that doesn't mean that there aren't victims in a high society status. There are. We might just not come across them as much. Same for the males. We haven't come across as many of them, but it's not to say that they aren't out there.
Okay, thank you. So can you help others understand why it's so difficult to leave a situation in which a young woman or a young man is being exploited?
In my public presentations, I talk about this. It's it's like a jail with no bars. And you looking outside every day, and the door's unlocked, and you can walk out anytime you want, but in your mind you can't. The jail is in your mind. That's what it is. And it's as simple as really just love and fear. The traffickers, either they love them, or they think they love them, or they fear them. And between love and fear, and maybe a combination of both, it just locks them into that trafficking state, and they can't leave. And that's the constant push-pull that you have to make with these cases, especially with defense attorneys, when they'll say, well, the door was open. You could have left any time. See, the door's open. You could have ran off any time. It's not that easy for them. They cannot do it. They need help doing it. And they need somebody to literally grab their hand and pull them out of it. And it can be an advocate. It can be a cop. It could be a DCFS social worker. It could be anybody. But somebody has to be there to reach out and grab their hand and pull them out of it. They can't do it on their own. And when they do it on their own, that is a remarkable, remarkable girl that can do that on her own.
Traffickers are very good at finding very vulnerable victims, I think. And then they exploit that vulnerability within that victim, or that void that the victim has in their life, and they use that to get into that victim's life. And because of that, it creates a bond between the trafficker and the victim. And so, as Jeff said, it is very hard for them to now get away from that and see something different than what they had before, where that void was there before, and he or she has filled that void. So it is very hard for them to leave because of that.
I agree with everything that was said.
Okay. So, switching gears, describe what the coercion and recruitment process looks like for traffickers when they're targeting victims.
Well, the first thing they have to do is find a victim. So what I've seen as a common thread amongst the majority, if not all of our victims, are low self-esteem and low self-worth. For a guy to be able to come up to a girl and be able to propose to have her go sell her body for money, and the majority of women would be like, "Excuse me, get out of here! What are you talking about?" The reason these girls would even consider doing something like that is because of low self-esteem and low self-worth. So once they find their victim, and keep in mind that low self-esteem and low self-worth knows no socioeconomic barrier. There's very wealthy families that have girls that are low self-esteem, low self-worth, as well as very low socioeconomic. So that goes everywhere in our society. Then once they pluck them out of the crowd of potential victims, then the grooming process begins, which is promises and all that kind of stuff. Amanda can talk a little bit more about the grooming process.
Yeah, I'd say that traffickers are very well versed in grooming and seasoning their victims. They start with changing their identifications initially. They'll tell their victims, hey, if you're encountered by law enforcement, you're going to go by this name, which is not their true name. Keep my name out of it. They start instilling the rules of the game, basically, how they'll traffic these individuals. So they'll talk about a certain quota that a victim might have to reach by the end of the night. They'll talk about whether or not they should talk to particular individuals when they're making dates. They'll talk about prices for different services that their victims are going to be providing, and that's all part of the rules of the game. And then they'll move the victims along through different hotels, potentially different areas of the city that the victims aren't familiar with, so that makes them start to feel like, I don't know where I'm at anymore, and because of that I need to rely on this guy that's providing shelter for me or providing food for me. Sometimes then they start instilling some type of punishment or threat, and at that point then the victims feel like there's no turning back. You know, this guy has come into my life initially. Guy or gal, I should say, has come into my life, and they've filled this void of mine, and they've changed my personality, my name, they've instilled all these rules, they've moved me around, and I don't know where I'm at anymore. I've got to rely on this person. Right. So they're very good at that grooming and seasoning, and then that develops the bond that we as law enforcement officers and prosecutors have to work against.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. So when fighting human trafficking, we're aware that traffickers employ the use of force, fraud, or coercion in securing their victims. So how are you seeing this play out?
Mostly in the form of force and coercion. It's the coercion comes with the whole Romeo pimp boyfriend thing, and that's the coercion, getting her to do things that she doesn't want to do, getting her to become dependent on him, and then eventually when she expresses a desire to leave, then that's when the force comes in, and some of the force can be absolutely brutal. These pimps can at times know no bounds in the amount of force they can apply to these girls.
So when you are working with a child trafficking case, what practical help is necessary for you in the work?
For law enforcement, it's the practical stuff is the communication, making sure our victims are up to date. If our victims are many times they're AWOL, they're out of their placement, but they're still talking to their advocate, they're still talking to their social worker. We can still get messages through the advocate, through the social worker. We've had victims who didn't want to be in the foster home, but said, I'll come to court. That's okay. I just don't want to be in the foster home. Okay, well, we can work around that. So that's the practical help, being able to get our victims to and from court safely. And then if there's security issues, then making sure that we transport the victims to and from court and having our advocates be able to set that up. And then otherwise, in practical help beyond that is assisting us with communication with our victims.
Yeah, I'd echo playing our roles, right? Advocates are advocates, and they're advocates for a reason. They're there to help our victims with things outside of our investigation. We're there to investigate the crime and find the evidence that we need to prosecute the trafficker. So practically, it's just us doing our jobs and doing it in a team environment.
Everybody stays in their lane, does their job.
Guillermo, did you want to add to that?
No, I agree with them.
Okay. So I think, obviously I'm a person who's not law enforcement, and I think for those of us that are not in your field, it can be easy to be critical or to not understand all that you have to balance. So how do you balance the needs of the community versus the needs of the victim in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, this is a tough one. This is one that the prosecutors and the law enforcement have to balance versus the needs of the community versus the needs of the victim. Because you have to take a look at it. We all care about the victim. We all want to rally around the victim. Our detectives start to develop, like sort of emotional attachments towards these victims. And then sometimes I have to pull them off and say, dude, or detective, you need to focus on the case. And you can't focus on the victim, and necessarily you need to focus on more victims. Our point is, and that's the thing with the prosecution is, if we take this pimp off the street, we avoid more victims. Okay, but if we rally around only this one victim, then and then this victim can't come to court, we can't get the evidence, then we have to let this person go, and then that's a negative effect on the community. So it's always it's a balancing act that a lot of times the cops don't have to make. The district attorney has to make that, or the prosecutor has to make those calls, but we have a lot of input in it.
That's a tough one. My job, as I said earlier, is I want to hold that trafficker accountable. And sometimes I do it when the victim is on board, and sometimes I do it when the victim doesn't want to go along with the prosecution. And there are certain situations where we have a very dangerous trafficker, somebody who has used force, violence on a victim or multiple victims, and we need to get that person off the streets and into state prison. And we are put in a position where if we have an extremely uncooperative victim and they're hiding out, we know where they are, we need to send law enforcement out to get them. And we do that as a last resort. We try to communicate with them, or law enforcement tries to communicate with them. Hopefully that prior relationship between the investigating officer and the victim will assist in getting them into court. But sometimes we need to send the IO, or the investigating officer, out to where the victim is and to bring him into court. And it's a very, very difficult decision because you don't want to re-traumatize the victim, you don't want to re-victimize them. However, there are certain individuals that we need to get off the streets.
So one of the unique aspects about the work that you all are doing around this issue is that you are addressing both local and federal law. And so over the years, federal law has evolved local laws have evolved to address the growing needs of this population and to make sure that we keep our communities safe. So what are some of the differentiating factors between local and federal cases?
As we're working the investigation, we kind of deem where it would be better suited. For us federally, we have to prove some type of interstate nexus, and that can be affecting interstate commerce as well. So that could mean that our victim is traveling across state lines, our victim potentially is using the internet, they're using some type of product that's not made in that particular state but is distributed amongst that state, perhaps in a different state like condoms, or they're using interstate hotels, interstate highways potentially. So even within the state of California, we have interstate highways, and if our trafficker is taking a victim from San Diego up to Sacramento and using the interstate highway, we could potentially look at that federally. So there's different ways that we could pull a case into a federal prosecution.
Okay. And Guillermo, could you address that from a district attorney perspective?
Sure. So in California, we were blessed in 2012 with a new statute that dealt with human trafficking. Up until that point, the punishment for human trafficking was substantially larger on the federal side. But in 2012, the punishment for the state law human sex trafficking became very powerful as well. So essentially, we'll get all the cases from law enforcement that the federal authorities, they don't have that interstate connection, or maybe it's a lower level case that they don't want to assume the responsibilities over. And also sometimes it's just the investigating officer thinks this is a case better suited for my office. Sometimes it's better suited for the federal authorities.
Wonderful. So we've had a wonderful discussion so far, and I think it's really important that we end with this question. I'd love to hear you share some success stories of working with an advocate and other partners towards justice for this population.
Well, you have to redefine justice, or I'm sorry, redefine success when you're working human trafficking cases, because many times success, especially, and I have to tell my detectives this, that it's not going to always end up with bad guy in state prison. It might just end up with the girl being released to DCFS, being really working with Saving Innocence, and then I watch her graduate high school. And that's success. And nobody went to jail. And I'll never know who the guy is that trafficked her. And I don't really need to know. So it's redefining success. So the biggest success story for me was last year, going to a high school graduation party with Saving Innocence. Well, all these girls got their GEDs and they all graduated high school, and I was just overwhelmed by it. That's success, and I don't know if any of those traffickers went to jail, or maybe one or two did. I don't know. That's success to me.
I worked in investigation when I first started working these cases, where I had a juvenile victim who was trafficked from New York down to Florida. And initially when we encountered her, she was in her trafficking situation. So we immediately contacted our victim specialist and brought her to scene, and she was able to provide the basic needs that the victim needed. And then she worked with child welfare system and advocacy centers to get the victim from Florida back up to New York in her home state. After that, we still were working our investigation. So our victim specialist up in the New York field office then was in contact with one of our NGOs up there who provided direct services to victims that have been trafficked before. And that was a good partnership up in New York for me. And had I not had them working together in that relationship, it would have been much more difficult to then bring the victim back down to Florida when it came time for trial. So again, we had to use during trial our victim services, our specialists, to make sure that victim was okay throughout that process. They spent time with the victim prior to testimony and then after. And as law enforcement officers, we also took a protective role of that victim while she was back in the state that she was trafficked in. So it was a successful story, and it really being one of my first investigation, it really showed me how that victim-centered approach really works. And I was thankful to have the already developed relationships when I came into that position. But that was a really successful story then, because her traffickers were both prosecuted and found guilty.
It's amazing. Thank you.
So I've been lucky in the sense I've had a fair amount of success stories because of the advocates I've been able to work with and the other team players, but one really, really sticks out in my mind. I had a case, it was last November, it was around the Thanksgiving holiday. It was a one victim, one defendant human trafficking case where the victim, she was about 15 years old when she was initially trafficked by the defendant. He went to state prison on an unrelated case. As soon as he got out from state prison, he started trafficking her again. This girl, unfortunately, had a lot of problems. Family issues. She already had one child that she couldn't take care of. She had been involved in the criminal justice system. And as we were moving forward with the case, nobody knew where she was. It came time for trial. I was going to try to prove the case in other ways without having her. And I really, really wanted to get for this trafficker to be held accountable because his text messages to the victim were probably the most degrading I've seen. It was a trial that was set for like a Monday. The investigating officer called me, I want to say Friday or Saturday, and says, hey, the victim has turned herself into juvenile hall. She wants to get her life together. She's pregnant. Turned out she's pregnant with twins now. So we have her for trial. So I'm like, all right. Like, you know, I don't think she was aware of the fact that we were going to do this trial. But she ended up coming to court. She was brought by the probation department. And as soon as I walked in the room to talk to her, to touch base with her, she was pissed. This girl wore her emotions on her face. I can tell that she was just extremely upset about being there. This is the last thing I think she expected when she turned herself in. So I sat down. She had a public defender who was representing her. An advocate from Save Innocence was there. And I told her, this is what we got. This is what we're going to do. You're either on board, you're not on board. Let's do this. And she was upset, but she had a team. And I'm confident because I say my things and I step out hoping that the rest of the team, the attorney, the advocate, will do some work, right? Get that girl to come around. And I left, and then eventually she testified, and she did amazing. She laid everything out. She gave, her testimony was excellent, excellent. And the transformation in her from when I first saw her to when she left was crazy. When I first walked in, she was upset, as I indicated, but then the second day after she testified, she had a smile. You can tell that she was relieved, she was happy, she was proud of what she had done, and it was just really, really cool to see that. And also the great thing about that case was the jury found him guilty. I had walked in not expecting to get a guilty verdict, but this victim did amazing. I got the guilty verdict, and now he is a convicted human trafficker. He'll be a lifetime sex registrant, and he's in state prison for about 7 or 8 years.
Wow. Wow. This has been such an insightful discussion, and we hope this has deepened your understanding of the role law enforcement plays in addressing CSEC. I'd like to say a very heartfelt thank you to all of you for the incredible work that you do. You are evidence of how powerful and valuable law enforcement is to our community, and we appreciate you. And I also want to say thank you for taking the time to listen to this discussion.